What superhero origins are your favorite? And which origins or origin retcons can you still not believe exist? Welcome back, Nerd Squad. It's me, Amanda, and we're counting down the top 10 superhero origin stories we also cannot believe happened. I know I can. Number 10, Spider-Woman. I love Jessica Drew, but her origin story really is just straight up weird. I even was explaining it to someone who's not familiar with her as Spider-Woman the other day, and even just hearing myself explain, it sounded weird to me too. I was like, just go with me here, it's a strange story. Jessica Drew was very young when she got sick, possibly because her father had actually wanted to experiment on her. That's, I believe, I don't know if we've ever pinpointed that, but seems likely, and had chosen to expose his family to a radioactive area. Her dad ended up curing Jessica of her illness by giving her a serum based off of spiders and putting her into stasis basically for years so she could heal. Now, by the time that she was healed and emerged from the tube she was held in, she was a young adult, although admittedly she was, as I said, healed, and she now had superpowers. But what she didn't have at the time, of course, was life experience, because she had pretty much spent all of her time in a tube. She had spent most of her life thus far in a tube in a suspended state, so it's easy to see how initially she got used as a pawn of Hydra's. There is also a version of her origin where Jessica was actually a woman who started out as a spider who simply evolved into a human form, which is even more bonkers of a story. Fortunately, this was later retconned to be a false memory implanted in Jess's mind, so that's how we make sense of that, although it is still a weird detail that someone would be like, yeah, I'm just gonna mess with her and make her think she evolved from a spider. Why not? And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd and you love when I talk about weird comic book stuff, I love talking about weird comic book stuff, check out our Top 10 Weirdest playlist. We all talk about weird stuff over there. It's a lovely playlist. Number 9, Captain Marvel. Carol Danvers' origin started out weird and only got weirder with time, it seems. This one is weird to me especially because I feel like it was kind of given a retcon that it didn't really need, but it got it anyways. But at the same time, I also acknowledge that the retcon may have simply been added to make Carol's origins make more sense or appear more streamlined. Carol Danvers was a security guard who ended up acting as an ally for and falling in love with the original Mar-Vell. At one point, her life was endangered by Mar-Vell's vengeful rival Yon-Rogg when the device known as the Psyche Magnetron exploded. In that moment, Carol wished that she was more like Mar-Vell, and so she became as such, because that's what happens when you get caught in a Psyche Magnetron explosion. She ended up manifesting similar powers and adopting the superhero moniker Miss Marvel. Years later, Carol has taken up the mantle of her former mentor, Captain Marvel, which is why we know her as such now, and has also learned that apparently this whole time, on her mother's side, she was actually half Kree, which is the same alien race that Mar-Vell belonged to, which also, I guess in part, accounts for her abilities manifesting. Though I think it's kind of fine that like kind of a wishing machine just allowed her to have those abilities. I think that makes sense too, but half Kree, let's do it. Number 8, Bouncing Boy. Bouncing Boy is Chuck Tane, and not only is he ridiculous in terms of his own abilities and appearance, but so is his origin story. He's known for being a member of the futuristic superhero team, the Legion of Superheroes, or he's known for eventually being a member of that team. This team hails from the 31st century, where they're teen heroes who are known not just for protecting the Earth, but also any other worlds that belong to the group known as the United Planets. Bouncing Boy himself initially was not considered good enough in the original continuity to join the Legion, trying out and failing to be accepted twice prior to finally securing his place on that team. Probably because of how odd his powers are, honestly. One day during a sports match, he made the mistake of drinking super plastic fluid by accident, which is what gave him the ability to basically inflate himself and turn himself into a human bouncing rubber ball. Why we call him Bouncing Boy. Number 7, Hellboy. Some might not think Hellboy's origins are that weird, but I would challenge that line of thinking. I think Hellboy's origins only seem normal because we know him so well at this point. But it's pretty weird that an organization who is kind of known for hunting monsters would retrieve him after he was summoned by a dark World War II German cult and apparently is destined to bring about a massive apocalyptic event, and yet would still choose to raise and adopt him and just raise him up among their ranks. It just seems like an odd choice, I think, when we consider his origins. I love it for him, but it's weird. Number 6, Vampirella. Vampirella has to have one of the weirdest origin stories ever. Possibly one of the reasons that I love her so much. Especially when you consider how many times it has straight up changed on her. She's had a lot of retcons in her origins. I think my favorite one though, my favorite version of her origin though, is still kind of the weirdest by most people's standards. Her first origin. Although to me this one actually feels a lot simpler than the rest of what we were given for Vampy later on with Lilith and Hell and all that stuff. I'm not talking about that aspect of her origin, but instead I'm talking about Draculon, the original Draculon, which initially was a whole other planet in outer space where a bunch of other alien vampires like Vampirella lived. Instead of having water on their planet, blood flowed through and around it. But after a catastrophic event where all the blood basically kind of like dried up, they had like a major drought, Vampy left her homeworld for Earth. She even makes her way to Earth in a very interesting fashion, basically kind of like hijacking the spaceship of some astronauts who crash landed on Draculon after discovering that the life force energy powering them, their blood, is actually drinkable to her and can act as a food source. Very strangely convenient, and I love it. Number 5. Silk. Silk just had a really weird life in general, never mind her origin story, although that admittedly is also pretty weird, which is why she's on my list. Sydney Moon was one of those folks who was created as a character later in terms of comic history, but who was woven into the fabric of the original history as though she was kinda always there. She went to the same school as Peter and happened to be bitten by the same radioactive spider. However, she learned much earlier on about spider totems and as a result was hidden away in a bunker for years, growing up without much contact with the outside world. She also has a whole thing tied to Peter when it comes to her origins in terms of her feeling real frisky around him because they're bitten by the same spider, but fortunately that's in the past now. But that was a thing, and it was weird. Number 4. Dogwelder II. Dogwelder is just straight up weird, and I feel like weird is a timid way of putting that. I don't know if we'd actually even call him a hero, a straight up superhero, based on the fact that what he does sounds kind of villainous actually, but he is supposedly a part of a superhero team, albeit a kind of terrible superhero team, but still I feel like we kind of need to count him, even though I myself am very skeptical about categorizing him as a hero, but he is categorized as such in the comics, so here we go. The original Dogwelder was downright dastardly, but Dogwelder II, his successor, is at least not really fully in control of what he does and definitely has, one of the weirdest origin stories ever as a result, so at least he's a little bit better but also weirder. He ended up stumbling upon the original Dogwelder's equipment and became possessed by it, compelled to weld dogs to people. Despite having what seemed to be a happy life with his family, Dogwelder II could not stop himself, could not resist the urge from welding his kids to the dog. As a result, his wife divorced him and later remarried. That's what you do. Also, what a weird story. Also the fact that he's still holding out hope, like maybe one day I'll be able to talk to them again. I don't think you come back from that, my friend. I think you're done. Number 3. Howard the Duck. Howard the Duck hails from a planet known as Duck World, where apparently ducks are not only intelligent, but also, coincidentally, happen to speak English, as so many on Earth do. What a coincidence. As weird as that sounds though, what's even weirder is the way Howard got to Earth, which is kinda debated in the comics with a few different stories telling this tale. Although I personally like the version where it's mentioned that Florida is basically located at the center of the nexus of all realities of Earth 616, which I think is pretty wild and pretty funny and kinda great. I also love that in that version of the story that's kind of where like Howard first appeared, was in the Everglades in Florida. It's just funny because he obviously is also supposed to be a parody on Donald Duck, so yes. Number 2. Scarlet Witch. Wanda Maximoff has one of the most simple and yet at the same time convoluted origins in all of comics. Initially she was simply a young woman who was a mutant and was saved by Magneto alongside her brother Pietro, aka Quicksilver. Feeling indebted to Magneto for saving their lives from an angry mob, they pledged themselves to Magneto's cause, serving him as members of his Brotherhood of Mutants, or Brotherhood of Evil Mutants if you prefer. However, later on we learned that Magneto was also their dad and that the children were simply adopted by the Maximoffs. It's kind of have like two groups of parents. Wanda's magic would go from mutant originating hex powers to being tied to Chthon to chaos magic to simply just magic that was passed down from her mother, who is also known for being a powerful witch. And Magneto would go from being unaware father to birth father to emotionally complicated dad to Magneto, you are not the father. And more recently was like more of an adopted father to Wanda and Pietro himself before he kick the bucket, although he'll probably be back at some point soon if he's not already at the time of this recording. Wanda would go from being a mutant outcast to mutant villain to mutant pretender, having been revealed as someone who was simply made to look like a mutant after being experimented on very early in life by the High Evolutionary for some reason, and finally back to being cool with mutants again after she was able to help them access sort of lost consciousness backups for mutants long thought lost and therefore unresurrectable. Basically, Scarlet Witch is just weird. That's the only way it goes. Doesn't matter what part of the origin story we're at, it's crazy. Number 1. Jessica Jones. Jessica Jones is another one of those characters who is retroactively given close ties to other heroes, with her character having been created later on in the early 2000s. But if you thought Silk was wild, Jessica goes pretty crazy into that. She had a crush on Human Torch, went to the same school and was in the same grade as Peter Parker, and her dad worked for Tony Stark. What? She would end up being exposed to radioactive chemicals in a tragic car crash that the rest of her family perished in. During her first flight, where she lost control of her powers, Thor saved her. Thor. Shortly after this, Jessica would take up the superhero name of Jewel and would end up almost immediately afterward being controlled by the Purple Man and forced to do what he bid her. All in all, her origin is pretty messed up and also just pretty wild. That's about it. I'll see you next time, but until then, you stay nerdy, YouTube. Bye!